She borrowed sugar from her neighbor nearly every week for 6 weeks straight. Any rancher's wife would have told you that's not actually possible. No household goes through that much sugar that fast. Cormac Vale noticed it too. He just kept his mouth shut and kept restocking his own pantry to make sure he never ran out for her, though he took his coffee black and had no earthly use for the stuff himself. Wyoming Territory, 1887. He'd eaten supper alone 11 years, one plate, one chair, the only sound his own fork against the china. She'd come west specifically to prove to an entire family back in Illinois that a young widow needed nobody at all. What neither of them expected is that the whole county would figure out what was actually going on between them before either of them admitted it to themselves, and that a man her late husband's own family had chosen for her would show up at her gate that same autumn, fully intending to collect on a promise she'd never actually made. Stay to the end. What she says to him is the same thing it took her all summer to finally say to herself. Cormac Vale ate supper alone most nights the same way he'd eaten it 11 years. One plate, one chair pulled up to the table, the only sound in the house his own fork against the china, and some evenings the old ranch dog Scout sighing his way into sleep by the stove. He'd grown entirely comfortable with that silence. He preferred it, he'd have said if anyone had asked, though nobody ever did. That routine changed the spring a new neighbor moved onto the property half a mile down the road, a young widow named Clementine Hayes, who began appearing at his door with excuses that grew simpler each time. A little flour, a borrowed tool, a handful of eggs, and almost every week sugar. Cormac noticed the pattern well before he said anything about it. He simply preferred, for reasons he hadn't fully examined, to turn his curiosity into a joke rather than a question. Clementine had arrived in Wyoming that spring with a small inheritance, a modest homestead claim, and a determination that bordered on stubbornness to prove she could manage a farm entirely on her own. She'd buried Edwin Hayes 2 years before, back in Illinois, a fever taking him fast, in a way that left more grief than warning, and had spent those 2 years listening to well-meaning relatives suggest, with increasing frequency, that a young widow ought to remarry rather than attempt something as impractical as running her own claim. "You'll want help within the year," her husband's mother had told her plainly, the week Clementine announced her plans. "A woman alone doesn't prove anything out there except how much she's willing to suffer to avoid asking for what she needs." Clementine had come west anyway, partly out of grief and partly out of something closer to spite, determined to prove that particular prediction wrong. The trouble was, a homestead run entirely alone had a way of running short on exactly the small, ordinary things a household needed. And Cormac Vale's farm happened to sit close enough to make borrowing considerably more practical than a full day's trip into town to replace what she'd miscalculated. Scout met Clementine before Cormac fully did, in a manner of speaking. She arrived at the property line her second week in the territory, lost, trying to find the shortest path into town, and it was Scout who trotted out to the fence first, tail working, entirely unbothered by a stranger the way he generally was bothered by most people who wandered onto Cormac's land. "Friendly fellow," Clementine said, scratching the old dog's ears while Cormac came around the barn to see what had drawn his attention. "Doesn't take to strangers much," Cormac said, faintly surprised. "Perhaps I don't strike him as one," Clementine said, and rode on toward town, leaving Cormac standing at his own fence line, turning that over longer than the moment likely deserved. By her third visit to borrow something, Scout had stopped waiting to be introduced at all, and took to meeting her wagon at the gate before she'd even climbed down from it, a small betrayal. Cormac noted with some private amusement, considerably faster than his dog managed to. The borrowing became a habit neither of them named directly. She came for a hammer one week, insisting she needed a proper one for a fence repair, though Cormac noted, watching her ride up, that a perfectly serviceable hammer already sat strapped to her own saddle. "That one's no good," Clementine said when he pointed it out. "Looks remarkably like a hammer from here." "Then perhaps your eyesight's better than mine," Clementine said, entirely unbothered, and took his instead, leaving her own leaning against his porch rail for reasons neither of them examined closely. Eggs came the following week, when her own hens proved slower to lay than she'd hoped. And sugar came up with a regularity that outpaced any reasonable household's need for it, appearing in her requests almost weekly, regardless of how much she'd borrowed the time before. Cormac noticed. He kept a running private tally in his head without meaning to, and found himself more than once restocking his own sugar supply specifically in anticipation of her next visit. Though he took his coffee black and had no earthly use for the stuff himself. It was on a bright morning in early June, watching Clementine cross the yard toward his porch for what he calculated was the 5th sugar request in 6 weeks, that Cormac decided the joke had been sitting too long unused to keep to himself any longer. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes," he said, leaning against the door frame. "Let me guess, I only need a small amount," Clementine said, holding up an empty jar with the same practiced apology she always brought. Cormac smiled, unable to resist any longer. "Keep borrowing sugar and folks will think you want me." Clementine looked at him a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes he couldn't quite read. Then she smiled back. "I don't use sugar." He stood in the doorway with the words settling slowly into place, understanding all at once that the pattern he'd been tallying 6 weeks had never once been about sugar at all. "You don't," he repeated, more statement than question. "Never have. I don't much care for the taste of it in coffee, and I've no patience for baking that calls for more than a spoonful." "Then why?" "I expect you already know why, Mr. Vale," Clementine said. "Same as I expect I've just made a considerable fool of myself admitting it before you did." Cormac found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he had no ready answer at all. She told him the rest of it slowly over the following weeks, once the first admission had cracked open a door neither of them quite knew how to close again. "I came out here to prove I didn't need anyone," she said one evening, sitting on his porch steps after she'd finally stopped pretending the visits required an excuse. "My husband's family had already decided, before Edwin was properly buried, that I'd be remarried within the year to whichever sensible man would take on a widow and her modest inheritance. I came west instead, partly out of spite if I'm honest. And instead you found yourself borrowing sugar from the one neighbor close enough to ask," Cormac said. "And instead," Clementine admitted, "I found myself wanting company I hadn't planned on wanting. From a man who seemed just as determined as I was not to need anybody." He told her his own reasons in turn, though it cost him a good deal more effort than it had cost her. "I had a wife once, back in Nebraska, lost her and our first child both the same hard winter to a fever that took half the county that year. Buried them within a week of each other and came out to Wyoming alone and decided, somewhere along that ride, that keeping my distance from people was a good deal safer than risking that particular grief twice." Clementine was quiet a long moment. "That's a heavy thing to carry alone. I've had plenty of practice. Though I find the practice doesn't work near as well since you started showing up at my door with empty jars." It was a shared fence line sagging along the boundary between their two properties. That gave them their first real reason to work side by side. "This post's been leaning since before I arrived," Clementine observed, hands on her hips. "Since before either of us arrived, most likely, never got around to it. It's my business now. Half of it's mine, same as half of it's yours." They spent a full Saturday resetting the posts, Cormac doing the heavier lifting while Clementine proved a good deal more capable with a post-hole digger than he'd expected. By the time they'd finished, it stood straighter than it had in years, and they sat together on the rail as the sun dropped toward the hills, talking of nothing in particular a good while longer than the finished work required. A hard summer storm caught Clementine still at his farm one evening in July, and Cormac insisted she stay rather than risk the ride home. "I don't want to impose," she said, though the thunder rolling closer made the protest sound a good deal less convincing than she likely intended. He put together a meal plainer than either of them was used to admitting they enjoyed: beans, cornbread, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and they sat at his kitchen table while the storm hammered the roof. "This is the first storm I haven't minded since Edwin died," Clementine admitted, watching the rain streak the window. I used to lie awake through everyone, counting the thunder, telling myself I wasn't frightened of being alone with no one to hear if something went wrong. Were you frightened every time? I simply got very good at pretending otherwise, even to myself. Storms are a good deal easier with company, Cormac said. Though I'd have told you a year ago I preferred them alone. What changed? Cormac considered the question, turning his cup slowly on the table. You started borrowing sugar you didn't need, he said, and Clementine laughed, the sound of it settling something in his chest he hadn't realized had gone tight. It was a stray gelding wandered off from Clementine's small herd one September afternoon that gave them their longest stretch of time together yet. They searched well past supper, working the problem from different angles, and found the gelding well after dark, grazing contentedly as though he'd never once been lost. They rode back slower than the trip strictly required, both quiet in the particular comfortable way of two people who no longer needed to fill every silence between them. By early October, the visits had mostly stopped requiring any excuse at all. Clementine came by most evenings with empty hands, simply for the company, and Cormac found himself, more often than not, already watching the road before she'd even left her own gate. Folks are getting used to seeing you here, he mentioned another evening, entirely without thinking, setting out a second cup of coffee before she'd asked for one. Clementine's hand stilled on the porch rail. Are they? Something careful entered her voice that hadn't been there a moment before. Suppose so, small county. Not much else to talk about most weeks. She heard it plainly enough the following week at the Mercantile, two women exchanging a knowing look and a lowered voice that carried considerably farther than either intended. Speculating about the widow who spent so many evenings at Cormac Vale's farm. Proving she can't manage without him is what it looks like, one of them said, not quite quiet enough. Clementine stood very still at the counter, the words landing squarely on the exact fear she'd carried west with her and never once fully set down. She stopped visiting that same week without explanation. What Clementine hadn't yet reckoned with was that her husband's family had never entirely stopped working toward the very outcome she'd ridden west to avoid. And that her silence that autumn had left the door open for someone else's plans to walk through it. In the second week of October, a letter arrived at her homestead, announcing that a Mr. Aldous Finch, a respectable widower of the family's acquaintance back in Illinois, a man of steady means who'd handled Edwin's estate affairs and had, according to his mother-in-law's letter, waited a decent interval out of respect, would be arriving in Wyoming Territory that same month. Having been assured by the family that Clementine's period of proving her independence had run its natural course and she would surely welcome a proper, sensible arrangement now. Aldous Finch arrived exactly as described, steady, respectable, entirely unobjectionable, and utterly unaware that he'd been sent to collect on an understanding Clementine had never actually agreed to. Your mother-in-law's letters made it sound a settled matter, he told her, sitting stiffly in her small parlor with his hat balanced precisely on his knee. I don't say that to press you, Mrs. Hayes. Only that I came a long way on the strength of what I was told, and I'd like to know plainly whether there's any truth to it. So neither of us wastes the other's time. Clementine looked at this careful, well-meaning stranger and understood he wasn't the villain of anything, simply another decent man swept into a plan made by people who'd never once asked her what she actually wanted. The same way they never had before Edwin's grave had properly settled. Mr. Finch, she said, I'm sorry you've come so far on a misunderstanding that isn't yours to have caused. There was never an understanding. Only a family eager to see one where none existed. I see. He was quiet a moment, turning his hat slowly. May I ask if there's a particular reason or simply a general one? Clementine thought of Cormac's porch, empty 2 weeks running, of Scout whining at his own gate, of a fence they'd mended together standing straight between two properties that had somehow stopped feeling like two. There's a particular reason, she admitted. Though I've been too much of a coward this fortnight to do anything useful about it. Aldous Finch, to his credit, laughed, a short, surprised, genuinely kind sound. Well, I've come a long way to be turned down for a rancher I haven't even had the pleasure of meeting. I'll admit that's a new experience." He stood, retrieved his hat properly. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Hayes, you seem entirely capable of managing your own affairs. I'll write your mother-in-law myself and save you the trouble of explaining it twice." He was gone within the week, gracious about the whole matter in a way that left Clementine unexpectedly grateful to him, and considerably more aware than she'd been in a fortnight of exactly how much time she'd already wasted being afraid of what the county thought, instead of simply riding the half-mile down the road. "I came out here to prove I didn't need anybody," she told her own reflection that same week, turning the conversation with Aldous over with a discomfort she couldn't shake. "Instead, I've let the whole county, and now my own dead husband's family, watch me prove I need him specifically. And I still haven't had the courage to say so to the one person who actually deserves to hear it." Cormac had noticed her absence within 2 days of its starting. By the end of the first week, with no sign of her at his door or along the fence line, he understood the absence was deliberate, and found himself setting 2 plates out of old habit before catching himself and putting the second one away. It took him the better part of the following weeks, through Aldous Finch's brief, unremarked-upon visit, which he heard about secondhand from Scout's continued vigil at the gate and nothing more specific than that, to understand what he was actually missing. He caught himself restocking sugar he had no reason to restock, watching the road long after he'd told himself to stop, finding the quiet he'd once valued so highly a good deal less comfortable than it had been before Clementine Hayes ever knocked on his door with an empty jar. "Not the sugar I'm missing," Cormac admitted aloud to the dog, who offered no particular opinion on the matter beyond a heavy sigh. He rode over to her property on a cold morning in early November, the same fence line they'd mended together now standing straight and solid between them. "Mr. Vale," Clementine said, careful and formal in a way that hadn't existed between them in months. "Mrs. Hayes," Cormac said back, matching her formality on purpose. "I've come to borrow something." "Borrow what?" "Sugar. Turns out I've gone and run out. You always take your coffee black. I've watched you drink it black every time I've been at your table." "I don't," Cormac agreed. "Seemed only fair, though, that I finally learned to ask the way you've been asking me all year, for a reason that was never really about what I claimed to need." Clementine stood very still. "The whole county's talking, Cormac. Your own kin sent a man from Illinois to talk me back into a sensible arrangement." "I only meant to give them less to talk about." "The whole county can talk about whatever it likes," Cormac said. "I've spent 2 weeks learning exactly how much quieter my house is without you in it, and I find I'm a good deal less concerned with what the Mercantile thinks, or what your husband's family arranges, than I am with fixing that." He paused. "I don't want a neighbor who borrows sugar, Clementine. I want a wife who never has to ask for a reason to come home. That's no small thing to ask a woman who spent 2 years insisting she needed nobody, and just spent a fortnight proving to a man from Illinois that she still doesn't need anybody's permission to choose her own life," Clementine said, her composure finally giving way. "It is," Cormac agreed. "I'm asking anyway because I've spent the same 2 weeks discovering that needing somebody and being weak aren't the same thing. Would ever either of us told ourselves riding out here alone?" "No," Clementine admitted. "I don't believe they are." She crossed the yard toward him with nothing in her hands at all except the plain truth of what she wanted. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you, Cormac Vale. Though I'll expect you to keep pretending you need to borrow things from me occasionally, purely for old time's sake." "I believe I can manage that," Cormac said, and kissed her there in the yard, the fence they'd mended together standing solid behind them. They married that December in a small ceremony at Cormac's farm, snow dusting the ground just enough to make the whole property look freshly scrubbed for the occasion. Neighbors came from 3 farms over, bringing pies and preserves and the particular warmth of a small county turning out for something it had apparently been hoping for since the 2nd or 3rd sugar visit. Scout, thoroughly unimpressed by the formality of the event, spent most of the ceremony attempting to steal biscuits from the reception table. The 2 women from the Mercantile attended, and had the good grace to look faintly embarrassed when Clementine thanked them with perfect sincerity for talking about her enough that she'd finally had reason to examine what she actually wanted. "I owe you both truly," Clementine told them over cake neither woman quite knew how to respond to. "I'd likely still be riding over here with empty jars and elaborate excuses if the whole county hadn't finally said the quiet part loud enough for me to hear it." "Well," one of the women said. Recovering her composure, someone had to. Cormac's toast that evening was short, same as most things he said, though it earned a laugh from the whole gathered crowd. "I never expected to marry a woman I met over a borrowed hammer," he said, raising his glass, "but I find I wouldn't trade the arrangement for anything the county's got to offer. Or Illinois, for that matter." By spring, they were working both claims as one farm, even if the deed office still called them two separate parcels. Clementine's proving up requirements were satisfied that same season, her name on land that was, by every practical measure, simply part of the life they were building together now. Rather than a solitary proof of anything. She never did take up sugar in her coffee. Cormac kept a full supply in the pantry all the same, and every so often, for no reason beyond the pleasure of the old joke, one of them would ask the other to fetch some from the shelf. Both perfectly aware there was no earthly reason the request couldn't have waited. "Any particular reason you needed that just now?" Clementine asked him once, watching him cross the kitchen for the sugar tin without apparent purpose. "Seemed like a reasonable excuse to walk past you twice," Cormac said, and Clementine laughed the same easy laugh that had first told him, months before a storm or a lost horse ever made it plain. Exactly what he'd been missing all those quiet years alone. Two coats hung by the door that had once held only one. Two cups sat on the shelf where a single chipped one had lived a decade. And most evenings, Scout slept by the stove between two chairs instead of one, entirely satisfied with the arrangement. Having apparently known how the whole matter would end long before either of the two people who owned him managed to admit it themselves. The following spring, a letter arrived from Clementine's mother-in-law, the first since Aldous Finch had written to report, in his own gracious way, that Mrs. Hayes had settled her own affairs entirely to her own satisfaction, and required no further assistance from the family in that regard. Clementine read it standing at her own kitchen counter, Cormac working at the sugar tin nearby with his usual unnecessary purposefulness. The letter was shorter than expected and considerably less pointed than the ones Clementine remembered from 2 years before. Her mother-in-law wrote that she'd heard, through the same channels that carried most family news, that Clementine had married a rancher of good standing and was running a farm that by all accounts was thriving. "I confess," the letter read, "I did not think a woman could manage such a thing alone. And I am gratified to hear I needn't have worried on that account after all, though I understand now it was never really about managing alone. Edwin would have been glad you found someone who let you be exactly as capable as you already were, rather than someone who needed you to be less than that in order to feel needed himself. I am sorry it took me so long to understand that was the actual thing you'd gone west to find." Clementine read it twice, folded it, and set it in the same drawer where she kept the letter Aldous Finch had sent that autumn, apologizing again for the trouble and wishing her well in a hand she'd come to think of, oddly, with real fondness. "Good news?" Cormac asked, setting the sugar tin down without having used a spoonful of it. "My mother-in-law finally stopped being wrong about something," Clementine said, and handed him the letter. He read it, set it down, and crossed the kitchen the way he still did most mornings, for no reason beyond the pleasure of crossing it, and kissed her once, unhurried, while Scout thumped his tail against the floorboards from his spot by the stove, entirely unsurprised. The way he'd been unsurprised by all of it from the very first afternoon, a lost widow's wagon had found her way to his gate instead of anyone else's. Cormac Vale had learned that keeping his distance from people was safer than risking the grief of losing them again. Clementine Hayes had traveled west, determined to prove she needed no one at all, and had very nearly let an entire county's gossip and a decent stranger from Illinois talk her out of the one thing she actually wanted before she found the nerve to say so herself. What they found instead, one borrowed cup of sugar at a time, was that the bravest thing either of them ever did wasn't proving they could survive alone. It was admitting, finally, that they didn't want to.